They didn't just steal my land, they built their perfect little neighborhood on it. 35 homes with manicured lawns, all on the property my grandfather left to me. For months, I watched them from the ridge, the sounds of their construction a constant torture. The HOA president told me I was powerless, that their paperwork was bigger than my legacy. Elias turning the spillway wheel. So, on the day the final sold sign went up, I made a choice. I didn't pick up a lawyer's phone number or a protest sign. I walked up to the emergency spillway gate I'd been forbidden to touch, the key my father gave me cold in my hand. They wanted a war over this land, so I gave them one. And I made sure every single one of them watched their American dream wash right down the hill. My name is Elias Vance, and for most of my life, Maple Creek wasn't just a place on a map, it was a part of my soul. The land I inherited wasn't some random plot. It was 200 acres of rolling hills and dense forest where my grandfather taught me to fish in the creek and my father showed me how to spot the best timber. The crown jewel was the old earthen dam and the reservoir it created, a serene, glassy lake that had been in our family for generations. It was my sanctuary, my quiet escape from the world. I built a simple life there. A modest cabin, a workshop where I crafted furniture, and the peaceful knowledge that this legacy was safe. I was the last steward of the Vance family land, and I took that duty seriously. The only sounds were the wind in the pines and the distant rush of water over the spillway. It was perfect, but perfection, I've learned, is a magnet for envy. The change started subtly. A developer bought the vast empty fields that bordered the western edge of my property. I didn't think much of it at first. Progress happens. Then came the bulldozers, the surveyors with their tripods and flags. They carved roads where deer trails used to be and named them things like Serenity Lane and Whispering Pines Drive. They were building a new, exclusive subdivision called the Estates at Maple Creek. I'll admit I was wary. But the project manager, a slick man named Carl Hammond who would later become the first HOA president, paid me a visit. He was all smiles and firm handshakes. He assured me our properties would coexist peacefully. He even complimented the dam, calling it a beautiful historic feature that would only increase the value of their new homes with waterfront views. He asked about the property lines and I, trusting the maps my grandfather had drawn by hand, showed him the old stone markers we'd maintained for decades. I had no reason not to trust him. That was my first mistake. Because while I was focused on the noise and the dust, I didn't notice their surveyors creeping further onto my land. I didn't realize that their smiles were a tactic and their compliments a strategy. They weren't just building a neighborhood next to me. They were drawing a target on everything I loved. The first letter arrived on crisp, official HOA stationery. It was addressed to me, Elias Vance, and it wasn't a welcome note. It was a violation. The heading read, Notice of Unapproved Structure and Environmental Hazard. My cabin, the one my father and I built with our own hands 20 years ago, was suddenly non-compliant. The wood-burning stove I'd used my entire life was a fire risk. The dam, a structure that had held strong for over half a century, was now deemed an unpermitted and uninsured liability. The letter demanded I submit full architectural plans for the cabin, decommission the stove, and provide $1 million liability insurance policy for the dam, all within 30 days. I felt a cold knot of anger form in my stomach. This was my land. My home. Who were they to make demands? I threw the letter down and marched straight to the new HOA office, a gleaming building that stood where a grove of old oaks used to be. Carl Hammond greeted me with that same plastic smile, but it didn't reach his eyes this time. He was flanked by 2 other board members, a stern-looking woman and a man who barely looked up from his phone. Elias, so glad you stopped by. I assume you got our welcome package? Carl said, his voice oozing false courtesy. This is harassment, Carl, and you know it, I said, slapping the letter on his desk. You have no jurisdiction here. My property lines are clear. Your development ends at the old stone wall. This land, the cabin, the dam, it's all mine. Carl's smile tightened. See, that's where things get complicated. Our surveyors have completed their work, and there appears to be a discrepancy. He slid a new glossy survey map across the desk. My blood ran cold. The line that denoted my property had shifted. It now cut a cruel new path that placed my cabin and a sliver of the land just inside their border. But the dam and the vast majority of the reservoir were still clearly on my side. It was a blatant, clumsy lie. This is fraud, I whispered, the words tasting like ash. It's a legally recorded survey, Elias, Carl replied smoothly. Now, regarding the violations. The fines are $100 per day per issue until compliance is met. It adds up quickly. I'd hate to see you get in over your head. This was their game. They couldn't just take the land they wanted, the valuable waterfront plots. So they were going to fine me into oblivion, drown me in paperwork and debt until I had no choice but to sell. They wanted it all, and they were using their own twisted rules to steal it. I refused to bow. I hired a lawyer, a young, optimistic guy named Ben who thought truth and old property deeds would be enough. We fought them. For every frivolous fine they issued, for unsightly native shrubs, for the disturbing sound of my axe splitting firewood, Ben would send a sternly worded letter. And for a while it worked. The fines would be put on hold only to be replaced by new, more absurd violations. The pressure was a constant, grinding hum in my life. The simple peace of my home was gone, replaced by the anxiety of waiting for the next envelope in the mail. I'd see Carl and his friends on their evening walks, pointing at my property, laughing. They were enjoying this. Then they escalated. One morning, a crew of men in hard hats arrived with a dump truck full of boulders. Without a word, they began dumping them at the end of my driveway, blocking my only access to the main road. When I ran out, furious, the foreman handed me a work order signed by the HOA. It cited a non-compliant and unsafe private road, and stated that access would be restored, upon completion of upgrades to county standards, upgrades I would have to pay for. I was a prisoner on my own land. I had to park my truck a mile away and hike through the woods just to get groceries. The message was clear: your life here is over. Give up. The final blow came on a rainy Tuesday. I received a formal notice from the county. It was a cease and desist order for the dam. The complaint, filed by the Maple Creek HOA, stated that I was operating an unpermitted industrial-grade reservoir without a licensed operator, creating an imminent threat to downstream residents. Downstream residents. Their residents. In the homes they built on my land. The order was clear. I had to drain the reservoir to a safe, non-threatening level, immediately. They weren't just fining me or blocking my driveway anymore. They were going to destroy the heart of my property, to kill the beautiful lake that had been there for generations, all under the false pretense of safety. They wanted to turn my legacy into a muddy pit. That was the moment something in me broke. The frustration, the helplessness, the sheer rage, it all crystallized into a cold, hard certainty. They had weaponized every system against me. The law was just a tool for them to wield. Talking was useless. Resistance was futile. I stood there in the rain, staring at the notice, then at the massive dam, at the calm, full reservoir behind it. They were so afraid of it. They thought it was a threat. A dark, terrible idea began to form in my mind. It was no longer about saving my home. That battle was lost. It was about balance. It was about consequence. They wanted to see what a real threat looked like. I was going to show them. The day of the HOA's emergency safety hearing dawned bright and cloudless, a cruel mockery of the storm raging inside me. They had scheduled it for a Saturday morning in the clubhouse, ensuring a maximum audience of their new wealthy residents. This wasn't a hearing, it was a performance. My final, public execution. I didn't bring my lawyer. Ben had advised me to settle, to try and negotiate a sale. He didn't understand. This was no longer about negotiation. I walked into that room alone. 100 pairs of eyes turned to me, curious, contemptuous, bored. They saw a relic, a messy obstacle to their pristine world. Carl Hammond sat at the head of a long table, a gavel in front of him like a judge presiding over his own private kingdom. He didn't waste time. Mr. Vance, thank you for gracing us with your presence. As you are aware, this board has unanimously voted that the structure known as the Vance Reservoir Dam poses a clear and present danger to this community. The county has issued its order. You will comply and begin draining it by 5 p.m. today, or face maximum financial penalties and immediate legal action. He spoke with the rehearsed gravity of a man who'd never gotten his hands dirty a day in his life. The room was silent, waiting for my begging, my pleading, my final surrender. I didn't sit. I just stood there, my hands at my sides, and looked at him. When I spoke, my voice was low, but it carried to every corner of the dead silent room. You're right, Carl. There is a clear and present danger here. A faint, smug smile touched his lips. He thought I was breaking. But you've misidentified the source, I continued. The danger isn't the dam. It's the fraud. It's the theft. It's the 35 homes you built, not next to my land, but directly on it. On the 5 acres my grandfather deeded to my father, who deeded to me. A murmur went through the crowd. Carl's smile vanished. Those are outrageous and slanderous accusations, Vance. Our surveys are a matter of public record. Are they? I asked. I reached into the old leather satchel I carried and pulled out a single yellowed piece of paper. I didn't need a stack of documents. I only needed one. This is the original land grant and survey from 1947, signed by the county surveyor and witnessed. It shows the property line is and has always been the old stone wall. The one your bulldozers conveniently knocked over and buried when you started construction. I let the silence hang for a moment, watching the first flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But you know what else is a matter of public record, Carl? Water rights. Specifically, the riparian rights for this watershed, which have been attached to this land grant for over 70 years. I don't just own the dam. I own the right to control the water it holds. I took a step closer to the table. Your fancy new survey might have fooled the planning department, but it doesn't change the law of the land. And that law says I have every right to manage that reservoir for the benefit of my property. And right now, for the structural integrity of my century-old dam, and for the health of the ecosystem, it has become necessary to perform an emergency spillway release. The blood drained from Carl's face. He knew what that meant. The other board members shifted uncomfortably. The residents just looked confused. What are you talking about? One of them asked from the audience. I finally turned to address them, the people living in the houses built on my stolen land. I'm talking about the fact that your homes are sitting in a natural runoff basin. I'm talking about the fact that the only thing standing between your living rooms and several million gallons of water is my dam. And my patience. I turned back to Carl, my voice dropping to a near whisper that forced everyone to lean in to hear. You filed a complaint saying my dam was a threat. You demanded I drain it. So, I'm going to do exactly what you asked. I'm going to grant your wish. I'm opening the main spillway gates. Not to the safe level the county asked for. I'm opening them all the way. Chaos erupted. People jumped to their feet, shouting questions. Carl slammed his gavel, his composure shattered. You can't do that. You'll flood the entire development. You'll destroy everything. I looked him dead in the eye, a cold, placid calm settling over me. No. You did. The second you poured concrete on a floodplain you knew belonged to someone else. You built a neighborhood on a foundation of lies. And now, I said, checking my watch, in about 10 minutes, the truth is going to come rushing down that hill to meet it. I turned and walked out of the clubhouse, leaving a cacophony of panic and disbelief behind me. I didn't run. I walked with a purpose I hadn't felt in years, down the newly paved road, past the perfect lawns and up the hill to my ridge. I could see them all spilling out of the clubhouse behind me, pointing, phones glued to their ears. I didn't look back. I went straight to the massive iron wheel of the main spillway gate, the one they had cited, the one they had called a hazard. The lock they had installed to try and seize control of it hung broken on the ground. My bolt cutters had made quick work of it before dawn. I put my hands on the cold, rusted metal. This wasn't an act of rage. It was an act of consequence. With a grunt of effort, I began to turn it. The mechanism screamed in protest, a metallic shriek that echoed across the suddenly quiet valley. Below me, I could see the tiny figures of my neighbors standing in the streets, looking up, finally understanding the gravity of the man they had pushed into a corner. The gates groaned open and a trickle of water began to spill over the lip, quickly growing into a roaring, unstoppable torrent. It wasn't a wave to wipe them out. It was a relentless, rising tide to reclaim what was mine. It poured down the designated spillway channel, the one that ran right through the heart of their fraudulent paradise. I stood there watching the chocolate-brown water churn and flow, carving its ancient path through their modern world. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I just watched as the first streams of water began to curl around the foundation of the model home, the one with Carl Hammond's name on the sign. The system they had abused to break me was now powerless. Their lawyers, their fines, their threats, they were all just paper and they were about to get very, very wet. The sound was not the destructive roar so many disaster movies had taught me to expect. It was a low, relentless, grinding rumble, the sound of the earth itself reclaiming its rightful path. From my ridge, the scene unfolded not with explosive violence, but with a slow, inevitable gravity. The water didn't smash houses to splinters. It simply ignored them, treating them as temporary obstructions in its ancient bed. It filled the streets first, turning Serenity Lane into a swift, brown river. It swirled around mailbox posts and garden gnomes, then began lapping at garage doors. The designated spillway channel, a dry creek bed they had paved over for a scenic walking path, was now the agent of its own rediscovery. The asphalt buckled and split as the water tore through, a perfect metaphor for the flimsiness of their claims against the weight of truth. Down below, it was pure, undiluted chaos, but it was a silent chaos from my vantage point. I saw people scrambling, carrying valuables to second floors, trying to pile sandbags that were instantly washed away. I saw Carl Hammond standing in the middle of the rising water, his phone to his ear, gesturing wildly, utterly powerless. The police and fire department arrived, their lights flashing uselessly on the periphery. There was nothing they could do. You can't arrest a river. You can't ticket a flood. They came for me about an hour later. 2 county sheriffs, their boots muddy, trudged up the hill. They were calm, almost respectful. Elias Vance, the older one, said, his voice weary, "We need you to come with us, sir." I didn't resist. I just nodded, my eyes leaving the scene below for the last time. "I need to lock up my workshop," I said, and they waited. The booking process was a blur. The charge was a spectacular list: criminal mischief, reckless endangerment, destruction of property. The initial bail was set astronomically high. They wanted to make an example of me. But a funny thing happened on the way to a life sentence. The news vans didn't just go to the flooded neighborhood. They went to the county records office. My story, the simple, brutal truth of a stolen legacy, was a powder keg, and my actions were the spark that set it off. My lawyer, Ben, now armed with a cause and the original land grant, held a press conference that went viral. He didn't defend my methods, he defended my reason. He laid out the entire timeline of harassment, the fraudulent survey, the blocked driveway, the weaponized fines. Public sentiment, that fickle and powerful force, swung violently in my favor. I wasn't a madman, I was a folk hero, a symbol of every person who'd ever been pushed around by a petty tyrant with a rulebook. Donations flooded into a legal defense fund. Online sleuths dug into the developer's past, uncovering a history of shady land deals and bribed officials in other counties. The HOA and the development company, now facing a tsunami of lawsuits from their own flooded homeowners, scrambled to contain the damage. They tried to argue, but their case was built on quicksand. A court-ordered survey, performed by a neutral third party, confirmed what I had said all along. The stone wall was the true boundary. 35 homes, in whole or in part, were constructed on my property. The criminal charges against me were the first to collapse. The DA, facing a PR nightmare and a suddenly flimsy case, offered a deal: no jail time in exchange for a guilty plea to a misdemeanor. I refused. I wouldn't plead guilty to anything. A week later, they dropped all charges entirely. The civil suits were the real war. The insurance companies for the estates at Maple Creek descended, and they were not interested in a long, ugly public battle. They wanted it gone. A settlement was reached, its details sealed by a confidentiality agreement, but I can tell you this much: I don't craft furniture for a living anymore. The long-term consequences were a study in poetic justice. The development went bankrupt. The flooded homes, structurally compromised and blighted with mold, were deemed uninhabitable and were eventually bulldozed. The land they sat on was returned to me, as was always its destiny. Carl Hammond and the other board members were sued into oblivion by their former neighbors and moved away, their reputations and finances left in ruins. Today the valley looks much like it did before they ever arrived. The scars are healing, covered by new growth. The dam is still there, stronger than ever, after being inspected and reinforced by engineers I hired. The reservoir is once again a serene, glassy mirror. I still live in my cabin. The silence has returned, deeper and more profound than before. It's a silence that holds the echo of chaos, a reminder of the price of peace. People ask me if it was worth it. If the destruction, the legal nightmare, the stress, was worth a piece of land. They miss the point entirely. It was never about the dirt and the trees. It was about the principle. It was about the line in the sand that you decide for yourself, that you will not allow them to cross. Because if you let them move that line once, they will never stop moving it. We live in a world increasingly governed by fine print, by committees, by people who believe a title grants them wisdom and a rulebook substitutes for character. This story is a reminder, a messy, complicated, and extreme reminder, that those structures are only as strong as the fear they instill. The moment you stop being afraid of their punishments is the moment you realize how truly powerless they really are. The water always remembers its path. Maybe we should too.